For over 100 years, Japan's justice system has had two very different kinds of prison sentences. But in 2025, that's all about to change. We're talking about one of the biggest legal shifts the country has seen in modern history, and today we're going to break down exactly what this monumental reform is all about.
But before we dive into all the legal nitty-gritty, let's just start with the big question that's really at the heart of this whole debate. What is prison actually for? Is its main purpose just punishment, or should it be about actively trying to reform and rehabilitate people? That's the question to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this.
All right, so here's the timeline of what's happening. For more than a century, Japan has used two main sentences. But come June 1st, 2025, those two are getting scrapped and merged into one single unified sentence. Yeah, a system that's been in place for over 100 years is getting a complete overhaul.
So to really get why this is such a huge deal, we've got to first understand the system that's being replaced. Let's take a look at the old guard. Choeki versus Kinka.
Okay, it's actually pretty simple when you break it down. For over 100 years, you had two paths. Choeki meant you went to prison and you had to work, compulsory labor. Kinko, on the other hand, meant you went to prison without that requirement. The entire legal distinction, the whole thing, really just boiled down to whether or not you were forced to work.
And this is what's replacing them. It's called Kokin-kei. It's a new unified confinement sentence, and the whole idea is to get rid of that rigid work or no work distinction. The goal, at least on paper, is to create a much more flexible system, one where rehabilitation programs can be tailored to each person, whether that means work or education or therapy.
So you might be asking, why make such a massive change after all this time? Well, let's dig into the case for this new single sentence. For the people who support it, this is all about modernizing the system and giving it some desperately needed flexibility.
And this right here is a really fascinating piece of data that supporters point to. According to Japan's own Ministry of Justice, even for the inmates who got the Kinko sentence, the one without compulsory labor, a whopping 80% of them chose to work anyway. So what that tells you is that in the real world, the line between these two sentences had already gotten incredibly blurry.
So the folks who support this change are really building their case on three main ideas. First, it's about modernizing a system where that key distinction had kind of lost its meaning in practice. Second, they believe it creates a better framework for real individualized rehabilitation. And third, they argue it'll make sentencing more transparent and consistent.
So, for the supporters, the bottom line is this. They see this reform as a fundamental change in philosophy. It's about shifting the whole point of being in prison away from just punishment and moving it towards a system that's actually designed to help people get back on their feet and successfully rejoin society.
But of course, it is never that simple, is it? There are some very powerful arguments against this change, which brings us to the critics. So why are they so worried about losing what they see as a really vital legal distinction?
And this quote right here, it just perfectly captures the heart of their concern. For critics, a judge being able to choose between Choeki and Kinko wasn't just some legal technicality. No, it was a symbolic tool. It was a way for the court to send a very specific, nuanced message about the crime itself. They're afraid this new, unified system just steamrolls over that judicial power of words.
The opposition's case also has three main pillars. They're worried about losing that principled, symbolic distinction we just talked about. They see potential risks to human rights, specifically the right not to be forced to work. And they believe it actually weakens a judge's ability to hand down a sentence that's truly thoughtful and proportionate.
And this all leads to a very concrete fear. You see, that Kinko sentence, the one without labor, was historically really important for people like conscientious objectors or political prisoners, people convicted of crimes that weren't malicious. So critics are asking, what happens to them now in a new system where work is basically the default?
And this brings us right to the core of the whole debate. You've got two sides looking at the exact same words in the new law and coming to two totally opposite conclusions. Is this new system about giving prisons more flexibility, or is it about forcing people to work?
If you're a proponent of this reform, you see the law as a positive tool. You argue it's designed to let prison officials look at a person and ask, okay, what is actually best for this individual's rehabilitation? And then build a program around that answer, whether it involves labor or education or counseling. But the critics, they read that exact same law and they zero in on one little phrase. In principle, labor is obligatory. And for them, that phrase changes absolutely everything. They see it as a fundamental shift away from a system that had a clear no-work option to one where labor is the default. And that, they argue, is pretty much de facto forced labor. And here, you can see it side by side. It's the whole disagreement in a nutshell. One side sees a flexible, modern tool for rehabilitation. The other sees a slippery slope to standardized, compulsory work that completely erases personal choice and judicial symbolism. It's the same law, but two starkly different views on what it really means.
So, when you strip away all the legal jargon and the specific clauses, you start to see that this isn't just some technical legal debate. It's really about something much, much bigger, a fundamental question that's at the very heart of this reform.
Because what you're really looking at are two completely different competing philosophies. The new Kokinke system, it values things like efficiency, modernization, and practical, hands-on rehabilitation. The old two-sentence system, though, it was built on a foundation of principled nuance, the symbolic power of the courts, and the importance of choice.
And that, right there, is why this whole thing matters, even if you're thousands of miles from Japan. This isn't really a debate just about prison labor. It's a debate about what a society decides it values most in its justice system. Is it practical outcomes, or is it philosophical principles?
Which leaves us with one final, big question to think about. You can debate the legal text forever, but this reform really forces all of us to consider something more fundamental. When a society makes the decision to take away a person's freedom, what, if anything, does that society owe them in return?